Hello and welcome to OPA GC Sociology. This is the final social theory lesson. The title is What is the New Right Theory? This is a theory that's to some extent similar to the functionalist theory. It's got a few more elements to it and slightly more extreme in some ways. Just as you'll do now, if you could essentially respond to your own opinion on the following statement. The working class are in their position based on their culture. So in other words, their attitudes, their beliefs and actions, and not based on their economic situation. So based on their money, based on their life chances. So just write down for the first couple of minutes what you think of that. Right, so with that, it's not a black and white answer, but it's really just trying to get you to think about where you stand on it, and also trying to really engage in that stretch and challenge what various theories might think of that. You're probably going to have people like the functionists who are more likely to say that everything functions perfectly, and maybe the working class are in their position, rightly so, because of their culture. And then you might have on the other side have people like the Weberians and the Marxists, especially the Marxists, saying, no, it comes down to oppression and this continuation of working class struggle. We're going to be looking at this idea about class and whether it's a cultural or an economic thing in today's lesson. And it's arguably one of the more important theories, the New Right, especially in the 21st century. Really since the Thatcher and the Reagan era of the 1980s. So Thatcher comes to power in 1979, but her legacies really continued in the UK with neoliberalism, also referred to sometimes as neoconservatism. And it's exactly the same in America. Ronald Reagan in the 80s, and many of the policies that are being implemented today are very much neoliberal, and it just shows the legacy of Margaret Thatcher. Even people on the left, or allegedly on the left, like Tony Blair with New Labour in the Labour Party, have acknowledged the impact that Margaret Thatcher had on Britain. And she's a very decisive character, whether you like her or not. There's no denying she certainly had a legacy and an impact on the UK. And that really is seen as well in New Right ideology and theory. So we're just going to go over some of the key points here. I would like for you to note them down, especially those ones in red. So I'm just going to expand on some of these ideas. So the New Right, they're very much about individualism over collectivism. So this idea that it's all down to the individual, cause consequence. So, for example, if you work hard and you are good at something, it's all down to you. Nothing to do with, say, how good a school you went to, not to do how good your parents were, what the area was like you was brought up in, did you go to university and were you able to afford it, things like that. If you get wealthy, it's all down to you. It's not the collective, and it's this idea that we shouldn't work together. We should all be almost not quite fighting, but competing against each other. And that links in economically with market capitalism. It's this idea of free enterprise. The New Right very much agree with private enterprise. This idea that businesses really help civilization. Okay, they help its development through their competition. Okay, and therefore, because there's competition, they like the idea of choice. So just like a supermarket, there's lots of different choices that leads to this betterment, this better society. This is one I haven't really seen before of the New Right, but it does make sense to some extent. There's very much a cultural identity associated based on the state. What I mean by the state is not in terms of governance or political state, more in terms of national state, in terms of Britishness, for example, in the UK. And you might see that with lots of populist movements. There's also this big distrust of experts and the establishment. So you have people, I'll give you an example, Nigel Farage, who's associated with the UKIP and the Brexit movement. Even though himself was very much part of the establishment in many people's eyes, in terms of, I think previously was a stockbroker or something along those lines and earned lots of money, couldn't really consider himself part of the working class. It was convenient for him to ignore experts and to put himself on this side of us against them, and the them being the establishment. So you'd often see him campaigning with a pint in hand in a pub, pretending to be sort of a man of the people, as it were. And that's a classic example of the new right. They very much do not agree with experts or the establishment. And speaking of the establishment, they're very much about reducing the welfare state and governance from the government and the state in general. They think there's no real need to have this big state because private businesses will deal with it. They'll plug the gap. So you've got examples like private healthcare. They don't feel a need for, say, the NHS because they think private healthcare plans can provide that. Another example is the marketisation of education. So one of the things that Margaret Thatcher brought in the 80s was this idea, instead of schools in the local area working together, this idea that they're competing almost like businesses against each other. So to apply a more notable example, for example, in Thurrock, Ormston Park and the Trust, OAT, think of it like a business almost, are competing with the Harris trusts in the local areas. It's very much this competitive edge to make sure we're getting enough students and the best grades. It's very much competing. So that's individualism. That's not collectivizing. Or instead of all these schools working together and collectivizing, they're not helping each other anymore. They're all individual. But also it has this idea, it's very cereal box and very traditional 1950s sort of vibes. It's this idea of traditional gender roles, traditional moral standards, and then going back again is about welfare reform. So when we mean reform, generally it's associated with reducing the welfare state. So there's quite a lot of stuff to digest there. So I'm just going to give you a minute or two you might want to just go back and watch the last minute or two again, just so you can digest the knowledge and write it down. Right, so we're looking at the first theory within the new right, and it's from an anthropologist called Oscar Lewis, who coined the term, really, culture of poverty. So Oscar was exploring some of the poor areas and researching some of the poor areas of South America. And he came to the conclusion that poverty was becoming a cultural as opposed to an economic issue. So to do with people's beliefs and attitudes and actions as opposed to their financial situation and resources. So Oscar argued the poor passed on from generation to generation a design for living. So his thinking, it encouraged this idea within the poor about thinking about the short term instead of the long term. So it might be that you're let's use a school example again. It might be that your parents, instead of encouraging you to think about career paths and think about jobs that are perhaps going to pay a bit more, it might be thinking short term in terms of a quick employment that doesn't pay well. Or it might be just encouraging this culture of maybe suspicion towards academia and education. So maybe not being fussed if your parents might not be fussed if you're mucking about in school. It's this short-term enjoyment, having fun with your friends instead of long-term putting in the effort and getting on with it. So if you could just summarize that idea for me, please. So Lewis also talks about a few more things. So where poor areas felt helpless in their poverty, they would often resort to focusing on the present. So like we said previously, they're thinking about the short term as opposed to the long term. And it's encouraged a lack of participation in the local community. So that might be not voting, or it might be not really taking an interest in your children's education. It might be not helping your neighbours out. It's very antisocial, essentially. And it also led to dysfunction. Okay, and the idea of dysfunction is very subjective, but it was maybe this idea of abuse or divorces or crime. And that often exacerbated, made worse the poverty cycle. So sort of almost recycling this idea of poverty, not because of economic situations, but through culture, so through choice in many ways. So if you just get a summary down of Lewis's ideas of the culture of poverty, and maybe just pause the video. Okay, and then perhaps one a bit closer to home is Charles Murray's idea of the underclass. So Murray studied poor areas in the UK and the US during the 1980s and 1990s and found that there was an underclass below the traditional working class. So you might have this idea of working class, middle class, upper class, and the working class can still be respectable, still be good. All it is really is their economic status and hierarchy. And then below that, Murray said there's this underclass. And the underclass were not just poor, but they also behaved badly. There was this culture of being bad. And it was likely to cause social issues, such as an increase in crime and antisocial behaviour. So Murray goes as far to say that these people in the underclass were generally from non-traditional family types. So generally he sort of stigmatizes and points out single parent families or those who cohabit or to some extent blended families, suggesting that essentially this lack of a male and female role model within the family, a mother, father, leads to children being poorly brought up and making the children antisocial. So just as Oscar talks about this recycling culture, how this culture recycles poverty and the poor, so too does Murray talk about this recycling from generation to generation of an underclass that are badly behaved. Okay, and Murray also believes that the underclass were quite deviant or even criminal in some cases because they didn't share the same values as the rest of society. They also had a culture of welfare dependency as an alternative to seeking out paid employment. So instead of going out and getting a job, there's almost this sense of entitlement that they were owed money by the state, by the government. Or maybe that the government was seen as a soft touch and easy to take money from. Okay. And Murray believed that a return to strict welfare reform, so reducing who and how the welfare state helps people, and also this sort of reimagining of traditional values was the only way to break this cycle. So you might want to get a note down of what the underclass are. And there's been many sort of depictions, especially in a lot of comedy or reality television over the last sort of 20, 30 years in the UK. So you have shows like Shameless, Little Britain with characters like Vicky Pollard, where they're just sort of depicting this underclass, this poor and quite deviant and antisocial group. Right, so we're going to look at some scenarios now, and I just want you to look through them. So I'm going to essentially put these images with little sort of statements next to it, and as I go through them, I'll give you perhaps 10 seconds in between each one just to write something down. But you might want to pause it just as each image is on the screen and just read through it. Okay, but just try and say, as you see the image and you see the statement, what might the new right think about this scenario? And as you stretch and challenge, how might the other theories think about it? How might functionalism or Marxists or feminists or interactionists feel about this scenario? So here's the first one. So Claire has been called in by the police. Her son, Tony, has been caught smashing windows at a local community centre. She is unemployed and is a lone parent. So I'm just going to stop there. You might want to pause it just for 15 seconds, write down your thoughts, and then we'll discuss what the new right might think of this scenario. Right, so you might have both the ideas of Lewis and Murray going through this. So this idea that maybe Claire, because she is a part of a lone parent, it might be seen, a lone parent family, it might be seen that her family is dysfunctional and not bringing her children up in the right way, hence why Tony has resorted to being deviant and criminal. But also there's this, it's hinted at this idea of being unemployed, that maybe she's welfare dependent as well. Okay, so if you've got a few of those key terms, maybe get them down if you haven't already. And we can see where the next few scenarios are heading. So the next one. Right, so in the next one, this is a bit of a two-parter. Really, what it's acknowledging is what it's doing is it's praising two things, really individualism. So James is doing better than Andrew, and it's implying it's based on merit. It's not really considering the environment, the educational environment around him. But if we then move on to the next one, so if you just read through that, I'll just give you 15 seconds. So yeah, in this one, you can see it's very much this marketization of education, this idea that they're almost like businesses rewarded for their good grades, and that they're competing. So James has the better school, he's a grammar school, and it gets extra funding because it does so well compared to Andrew's state comprehensive. And it just really employs this idea of free market. A Marxist might see this in a completely different light and really highlight this as an example of capitalist superstructures in play here, trying to reinforce this idea, or trying to reinforce this rich and poor divide. And also this idea of false consciousness and ruling class ideology, this idea that, James deserves his position is off merit, and not really, and sort of overshadowing really this idea that Andrew's, not considering that Andrew's had a poorer education, poorer quality. Okay, and then the final one, so just read that one. So yeah, very similar to the first one. We've got this idea here that that again, divorce has increased. So what the new right would refer to as dysfunctional family types has coincided with this increase in crime. So again, very much the ideas of Charles Murray and the underclass. Right, finally, so you might want to write down in a paragraph which theory you agree with the most, seeing as we've gone through all of them now, and just really stating why. So we've gone through functionalism, Marxism, interactionism, feminism, and the new right. Just state which one you agree with the most, and then we will move on to look at the new right critique. Right, so some of the positives of the new right, it does offer, whether you agree with it or not, an explanation of some social issues. It also, to some extent, it's a bit more extreme, but it supports the functionalist ideas of the family. So functionalists also like traditional family types. And we're going to look at Parsons' sex role theory later on in the year. But it links into this idea of social cohesion and how the value consensus can be passed on in this organic analogy where structures are fulfilling their role. And also we have to acknowledge, whether we like it or not, it has influenced welfare reforms and educational reforms since the 1980s, in the UK with Margaret Thatcher, and in the US with Ronald Reagan. But there are a lot of negatives here as well. So it does stigmatize the working class. It assumes that there is this culture where they're almost immoral, and it assumes that they're not thinking about the long term. And it neglects their economic situation. So we saw earlier there with looking at James and Andrew in their different schooling. You know, that's a structure there that has given one person a leg up and an improvement in life, and not the other. It doesn't acknowledge that people have different economic positions. It's also assuming that traditional family types are not dysfunctional. So you may be in this nuclear family, this idea of a husband, a wife, and children, but it doesn't mean it's not dysfunctional. Equally, it assumes that diverse family types are dysfunctional. There are many families, in fact, where there are lone parent, it's blended, it's cohabiting, and they work fine. Right, so that was the final lesson on social theory. We're now going to be moving on the following week with looking at what a social structure is, what a social process is, and what some of those social inequalities are. And then after that, we're going to be moving on to the half term, or the halfway point in the half term. We're looking at an assessment and how to answer certain questions.